20 pieces of silver are heavier than a mountain when they are the price of a brother's life. You can still hear the muffled pleas of Joseph echoing from the dry pit in Dothan, a sound no Hebrew ritual can wash away. Judah thought he could outrun the metallic scent of betrayal. He fled the accusing eyes of his father Jacob and the cold silence of his brothers, descending into the sun-scorched lowlands of the Adulamites. He sought to lose himself in the pagan dust of Canaan, peeling away the skin of his heritage like a discarded garment. He believed a new land could bury an old sin, but a man cannot outrun a God who sees through the dark. What follows is not a Sunday school story. It is a visceral dive into a house built on silence and a family tree rooted in a shallow grave. This is the brutal origin of a kingdom, from the cold-blooded calculation of a son's greed to a widow who forces the hand of destiny by becoming a ghost at the crossroads. Witness a patriarch stripped of his signet, his staff, and his pride, only to realize that the foundations of the Messiah weren't laid in a temple, but in the grime of a scandalous roadside transaction. This is the raw reality of how a breaker was born from wreckage to change the world. Judah did not just walk away from his family, he walked away from his soul. In the rugged hills of Canaan, far from the watchful eyes of the covenant, he sought to bury his guilt in the mundane. He found an Adulamite named Hira, a man of the world, someone who stood outside the heavy expectations of divine promise. And there, under a sun that felt indifferent to the God of his fathers, Judah looked upon the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. It was not a union of prayer, but a choice of the eyes. The flesh demanded a distraction from the spirit's rot. He took her, and in that act, he snapped a link in the covenant chain to mend his own fractured heart. He traded the sacred distinctiveness of his people for the comfort of a stranger's bed. The wedding was a functional necessity, a hollow ritual to legitimize his escape into a pagan identity. From this alien union, 3 sons were born: Er, Onan, and Shelah. On the surface, it looked like a legacy, but these were seeds planted in shallow, rocky soil, watered by a father's detachment. What kind of fruit grows from a vine detached from its roots? The fruit of Judah's union was a harvest of bitterness. Er, the firstborn, was the bearer of the name, yet his spirit was a hollow shell. To secure the line, Judah brought Tamar into the fold. She arrived as a spark of hope, a vibrant thread meant to be woven into the tapestry of a great house. But Tamar soon found herself an inhabitant of a sanctuary turned into a tomb. The scriptures do not detail the specifics of Er's depravity. They speak only of the result. He was wicked in the sight of the Lord. This is a significant biblical silence. Usually the text lists sins: idolatry, violence, theft. Here the silence suggests a darkness so internal, so visceral to his character, that the Lord struck him down without a formal indictment. There was no slow fading, only a cold body and a bridal veil catching the gray dust of a funeral procession. Tamar's dreams were shattered before they could draw breath. She stood in the shadow of a grave, a woman of the covenant suddenly cast into a void of uncertainty. But as the dirt settled on Er's remains, a chilling question lingered. What hidden cruelty did the firstborn commit? If the heavens fell silent, the impact was nonetheless absolute. One grave was still fresh when the law demanded a second wedding. In the ancient world, a widow without a son was a ghost walking among the living, a woman without a name, without a future. To prevent this erasure, the Levirate law bound the surviving brother to the widow's bed. It was a duty of blood, raise up an heir so the dead man's light would not be extinguished. Judah turned to his second son, Onan, commanding him to perform the duty. But Onan was a man of cold calculations. He understood the math of inheritance. If Tamar remained childless, the firstborn's double portion of the estate would eventually slide into his own pockets. He craved the intimacy of the woman, but he loathed the responsibility of the child. It was a calculated cruelty. Each night, Onan took what he desired from Tamar, but at the moment of life's potential, he drew back. He let his seed spill upon the dust, watching it vanish into the thirsty sand. It was more than a private act. It was a public betrayal of a dead brother's memory and a predatory theft of a woman's last hope. The ground drank what belonged to the future. God did not look away. The heavens, which had remained silent during the wickedness of now burned at the selfishness of Onan. He had treated a sacred covenant like a common transaction. For this treachery, the Lord took his life as well. In the span of a heartbeat, Judah stood over 2 shroud-wrapped bodies, 2 sons gone, 2 legacies buried in the dirt. Judah stands in the shadow of 2 fresh graves, and his heart has turned to stone. He looks at Tamar and sees a curse, a black widow whose very presence invites the reaper. Fear has replaced his duty. He looks at his youngest son, Shelah, and decides he will not lose a third. The lie is delivered with the weight of a false blessing. Return to your father's house, Judah tells her. Wait for Shelah to grow. It sounds like a promise, but in the hollow of his chest, Judah knows he is sending her away to be forgotten. He sentences her to a stagnant widowhood, a life suspended in amber with no protector and no heir. Judah closes the heavy door of his estate, the iron bolt sliding home. Tamar stands in the dust, watching the only family she has left retreat into the shadows. She begins the long walk back to her father's house. The boy will grow, the seasons will turn, but the gate will remain shut. The promise was meant to be broken. Grief is a silent thief. The house of Shua's daughter eventually fell quiet. The woman who had birthed his sons was now dust herself. Judah stood in a hollow home, a widower with an aching void, and a man who had left a daughter-in-law to rot in the silence of a broken promise. But life does not wait. The time for the shearing at Timnah arrived. It was more than a harvest of wool. It was a festival of release, a place of wine and the temporary suspension of the mundane. Judah washed the soot of mourning from his face. He was a father with no heirs, ripe for a distraction. In her father's house, Tamar heard the news. Judah is going up to Timnah. The man who held the keys to her future was stepping out of his fortress. She looked at her mourning rags, the coarse fabric that defined her as a victim. She had waited for Shelah to grow, and he had grown. She had waited for justice, and it had died of neglect. Tamar realized that if the law would not move for her, she would have to move the law. She stripped away the garments of the widow, preparing to transform herself into a ghost at the crossroads. The high sun of Timnah began to sink, casting long, jagged shadows against the road to Enaim. Judah walked with the heavy stride of a man who had buried his grief. At the crossroads, she sat, a silhouette against the dying light, her face a mystery behind the folds of a veil. To Judah, she was just a harlot waiting for a traveler. He did not see the desperate eyes of Tamar. He saw only a transaction that could dull his isolation. He turned toward her. "Let me come in to you," he demanded. Tamar's response was a hook cast into the dark. "What will you give me?" "A young goat," he promised. But Tamar was wise. She demanded a pledge until the animal was delivered. "What shall I give you?" he asked, impatient. "Your signet," she said, "your cord, and the staff that is in your hand." The signet was his signature, the cord his lineage, the staff his authority. To hand them over was to hand over his very name. Yet, blinded by impulse and the anonymity of the veil, Judah stripped himself of his legacy. The rough wood changed hands. The seal was pressed into her palm. He went into her, an act that would echo through eternity. He left her there, reclaimed his path, and walked toward the horizon, never suspecting he had left his entire future in the hands of the woman he tried to erase. He went back to his flocks, empty-handed and nameless, unaware that the seeds of a kingdom had just been planted in the dust. The sun dipped below the horizon. Judah had bought his moment, but at the cost of his identity. He sent his friend Hira to settle the debt and retrieve the items. Hira walked the path to Enaim with the kid in tow, but when he reached the crossroads, he found only the whistling wind. "Where is the temple prostitute?" Hira asked the local men. The elders looked at him with confusion. "There has been no prostitute here," they replied. "Not yesterday, not ever." Hira returned to Judah. The news was a cold splash of water. The items were gone. An anxious sweat broke out on the patriarch's brow. "Let her keep them," Judah muttered, a hollow attempt to reclaim his pride, lest we be laughed to scorn. He thought the silence of the road would bury his secret. 3 months later, the secret grew heavy enough to break the silence. Tamar's body began to tell the story. When the news reached Judah, it was delivered as a scandal. "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, is with child." Watch Judah's reaction. The man who abandoned his brothers and lay with a stranger suddenly finds his spine. He does not ask for the father's name. He demands the ultimate penalty, hiding his own cowardice behind the mask of an executioner. "Bring her out," he commands. "Let her be burned." He wants the fire to turn her into ash, so he never has to look into her eyes and see the promise he broke. He believes that by destroying her, he can bury his own darkness. But the flames he is calling for are about to illuminate a truth he never expected. The crowd gathers. Judah stands tall, the fire reflecting in his eyes. As the guards drag Tamar toward the pyre, she does not scream or plead. Instead, she reaches into her garments and produces 3 items: a signet ring, a woven cord, and a carved staff. She does not point a finger. She simply holds up the mirror. "Identify these," she says. "The man who owns these is the father of my child." The silence that follows is a physical weight. Judah reaches out, his fingers trembling as they brush the familiar grain of the wood, the staff he has leaned on for years, the seal that bears his name. Each item is a silent witness, a ghost returned to haunt the man who thought he could bury his sins in a ditch. The fire is still burning, but the heat has shifted into Judah's chest. He looks at the woman he condemned, the woman he lied to, and the transition from judge to guilty occurs in a single heartbeat. He drops the items. "She is more righteous than I," he whispers. It is a public confession that strips him of his pride and leaves him naked before the God he tried to outrun. He had demanded justice, and justice had found him. The labor came with the primal agony of a woman who had fought the world. Tamar felt 2 souls struggle within her, a mirror of the chaos that had brought her here. As the first child began to emerge, a hand reached out. The midwife tied a scarlet thread around the tiny wrist. "This one came out first," she declared. The scarlet thread was the mark of the firstborn, the legal seal of the inheritance. But God is a God of disruptions. The hand with the scarlet thread suddenly vanished, drawing back into the darkness. There was a violent surge of will, Before the midwife could comprehend the change, another child pushed forward, clearing his own path. He did not ask for the thread. He simply broke through. "How have you broken through?" the midwife cried. "This breach be upon you." They named him Perez, the breaker, the one who shatters the wall. Moments later, his brother followed, the faded scarlet thread still clinging to his wrist like a forgotten promise. They named him Zerah. But the hierarchy was toppled. The first had become last, and the one who forced his way through the chaos was now the bearer of the promise. Look at the dirt on the floor of that birthing room. It is the same dirt from the roadside at Naim, and the same dirt that covered Er and Onan. We expect holy stories to be clean. Instead, we find the roots of the kingdom growing in the middle of a scandal, born from a breach. Perez was the product of a broken promise and a desperate deception. Yet it is his name you will find etched into the ironclad genealogies of the future. He is the ancestor of Boaz, the great-great-grandfather of David, and the direct forebear of Jesus. The breach was a message. It tells us that the lineage of the Messiah was never about human perfection or clean lines of succession. It was about a God who weaves his glory through the ruptures of our lives. Only a breaker could pave the road for the one who would eventually break the gates of death itself. The story of Judah and Tamar is a brutal testament to the sovereignty of a God who refuses to be limited by human failure. A patriarch who sold his brother, a widow forced to play the harlot, a family line that should have ended in a shallow grave. Yet here, in the intersection of lust and desperation, the foundations were laid. We see a justice found not in the high courts, but in the dust. We witness a transformation that required a man to be stripped of his signet and staff before he could save his soul. This is the legacy of accountability. The breach of Perez becomes the bridge to the Messiah. God did not choose Judah because he was worthy. He chose him so we would understand that worthiness is a gift. He allowed Tamar's struggle so we would see that the divine eye remains fixed on the vulnerable, even when society fails. When you look back at your own life, at the promises you broke and the roads you shouldn't have taken, remember the signet in the dust. Remember that the greatest king to ever walk the earth traced his ancestry back to this roadside scandal. The genealogy of Christ does not begin with a list of saints, but with a list of the broken, the breached, and the redeemed. This is the scarlet thread of history. Grace always finds a way through the breach.